Welcome to today's discussion hosted by the Open Society Foundations and United Cities and Local Governments, UCLG. My name is Mbuh and I work with Open Society Initiative for West Africa. Please, for those who will need interpretation from English, kindly consult the chat box to see connection instructions. We have interpretation in English, French, Spanish. Today's event is the first in a three-part series on mandatory detention that we will continue over the next 2 days. But before we get into the discussions proper, let me first provide some context to the event. Across the world today, over 11 million people are estimated to be held in jails and prisons. This number does not include those held in other facilities, such as immigration detention centers, psychiatric institutions, compulsory substance treatment, and other detention facilities. The systematic recourse to mandatory detention to solve complex social challenges is often justified on grounds of maintaining public safety and order. As humans, we all aspire to live in healthy, safe, and free communities. However, there's been no causal link established between heightened use of mandatory detention and greater public safety. In the current global context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the issue of mandatory detention is even of added significance given its debilitating effect on people in closed institutions and other vulnerable groups. It is within this framework that the Open Society Foundations, in collaboration with United Cities and local governments, have brought together speakers from around the world who work on mandatory detention issues. These panels are part of the UN 75 Dialogue Series, an initiative led by the United Nations as it marks its 75th anniversary in 2020. The vision of the dialogues is to spark conversations around the world on priorities for the future and the role of international cooperation in resolving global challenges. Our panels will examine how the UN and its member states could adopt alternatives to mandatory detention to meet people's aspirations for order and safety. As a sponsor of the UN 75 campaign and the world's largest funder of human rights and civil society, the Open Society Foundations believes that the voices of those directly affected by mandatory detention need to be heard and taken into account in the search for solutions. The panels will therefore bring together people with a lived experience of mandatory detention from different communities across the globe, as well as people who work closely with those affected by mandatory detention. As the largest global network of local and regional governments in the world, UCLG brings together, represents, and defends local and regional governments at global level. As a convener of the Global Task Force of Local and Regional Governments before the UN, UCLG has coordinated a global consultation with local and regional governments that fed into a visioning report for 2045, calling for a world driven by communities that ensure effective social inclusion policies for the well-being of all, including the more vulnerable groups, eradicating discriminatory policies based on gender, age, religion, ethnic heritage, disability, sexual orientation, and targeting false narratives that often frame invisible populations as the cause of crisis. Through the Cities Are Listening experience, within which this dialogue is framed, UCLG has set a structural dialogue with civil society and other actors to move forward in unison towards a pact for the future in which no one is left behind. I will now introduce the keynote speaker of the day, Aryeh Neier. Aryeh Neier is President Emeritus of the Open Society Foundations and was founding president from 1993 to 2012. Before that, he served for 12 years as Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, of which he was a founding member in 1978. After he speaks, I will turn to today's moderator for our discussion, Depros Mochena, who is the Regional Director of Amnesty International for East and Southern Africa. It is now my pleasure to thank and welcome Aryeh Neier to deliver his opening remarks. Aryeh, please, the floor is yours. Aryeh, you are muted, please.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'm delighted to take part in this discussion and very pleased that this discussion is being held. The Open Society Foundations have been engaged in efforts to address the problem of mandatory detention for more than 25 years, since the point that we began functioning as a global foundation. And the reason that we made mandatory detention a main focus of our activities is that it has several characteristics. One of those characteristics is that it tends to punish people who ought not to be punished, people who may have drugs for personal possession, or people who may cross boundaries in search of asylum and end up in detention. A second reason that we were concerned with mandatory detention is that everywhere in the world, the principal victims of mandatory detention tend to be racial minorities. In the United States, it's African Americans by several times their proportion of the population. In Eastern Europe, it's the Roma, countries such as Hungary and Bulgaria. In India, it is the Dalits. And one can go on around the world, and everywhere in the world, there seems to be a mechanism principally for punishing and controlling racial minorities in different countries. Another reason that we were concerned with mandatory detention is that in many parts of the world, and this is especially true in Latin America and in Africa, a large proportion, a disproportionately large portion of those who are subject to mandatory detention are not people who have been actually found guilty of any offense. They are people who are awaiting trial. They are called under trials in some countries. And in many countries, the number of people who are detained while awaiting trial considerably outnumbers those who are actually punished for some kind of offense that has been proven against them in a court. Sometimes those who are held awaiting trial serve in detention for longer periods than they could serve if they were found guilty of various offenses. So these seem to us overwhelming reasons for addressing the problem of mandatory detention. The problem of mandatory detention is perhaps greatest in the country that I am a resident of, a citizen of, and that is the United States. The United States has about 5% of the world's population, and it has about 25% of the number of people worldwide who are incarcerated in jails and prisons. And it's important to recognize that the practice of widespread mandatory detention was invented in the United States. There had been detention historically, but of relatively small numbers of persons. There had been, for many centuries, physical punishments, and mandatory detention was conceived by some of the initial advocates of it as a reform measure to get over the practice of physical punishments, brandings, whippings, capital punishment, etc. So mandatory detention became a factor in the United States, a large factor in the 1820s. This was a period in which the urban areas of the infant United States were growing rapidly, and people were concerned with deviancy and dependency in the new cities of that era. And they blamed the cities themselves for causing people to go wrong. And so they devised the idea of removing people from the urban environment that they thought had made them go wrong, and often the family environment that made them go wrong. And they sent them to prisons and to other asylums, psychiatric asylums, juvenile asylums, almshouses for the poor, as a way of removing them from the corrupting environment. And that established the tendency to locate institutions where people are confined at long distances from urban centers, because they wanted to make the urban centers remote from the individuals who had gone wrong. And the idea was that a program of work and penitence would reform people, and that way the problems of society would be cured. Today we speak of penitentiaries, and the word penitentiaries comes to us because people were supposed to be penitent in these institutions to which they were remanded. Other countries were interested in these experiments in the United States, and countries such as France and England sent emissaries to the United States to study these institutions. So Alexis de Tocqueville and Gustave de Beaumont came to the United States from France to write a report on the prisons and other asylums in the United States. Charles Dickens, when he visited the United States and wrote his book, American Notes, spent most of his time touring the country, visiting prisons, because he wanted to report on them to Britain. And so the countries which became the world's largest colonial powers, France and England, adopted the practice from the United States, and they in turn introduced those practices to their colonies in different parts of the world. And that's part of the way in which the phenomenon of mandatory detention became a worldwide phenomenon. Of course, there were repressive countries such as the Soviet Union and China, which sent people into detention for their own political purposes. And until relatively recently, the countries of the former Soviet Union were second only to the United States in the number or the proportion of people who were confined in these kinds of institutions. And they still have much larger numbers than people in many other parts of the world. So it is a global problem. It is a problem that had some notions of reform attached to it in its early years. Those reform principles were thoroughly corrupted over a period of time, and we are left with the phenomenon of mandatory detention as it exists today. And it has been a crucial focus of the activities of the Open Society Foundations, and I expect it will continue to be at the top of our agenda in trying to promote open societies on a worldwide basis. Thank you.